It's been called the most autonomous spacecraft ever built. The Parker Solar Probe is on its way to the sun. Let's talk about what it took to get here and what comes next. Let's talk space.
I never want to hold again.
Falcon Heavy is in startup.
Go Atlas. Go Centaur. Status check.
Go Delta.
5, 4, 3.
So we're going to break this video into 3 parts. Part 1 will focus on the launch vehicle, Part 2 the payload, and Part 3 the silent question that was going on up until launch. Let's begin, shall we? So Delta IV is definitely my favorite rocket. I love Falcons for landings, but Delta IV is definitely my favorite because of all the cool little things about it. For instance, let's talk about the RS-68 engines that power the first stage. Unlike most liquid fuel engines, the RS-68s use what's known as ablative cooling. But to understand ablative cooling, we kind of have to understand how an actual rocket engine works. So while an engine is firing, an enormous amount of pressure and heat is exerted on the engine bell. Now, most of this heat is expelled with the gases, but a significant amount is transferred to the walls of the engine. So much so that if left unchecked, the engine would melt away or crack and explode because of the extreme pressures. So how do we get around this? Well, most engines use regenerative cooling, where propellant or coolant is flown around the engine chamber. The Merlin engines used on Falcon 9 do this. The tube you can see here is where cooler exhaust from the turbopumps runs before being dumped overboard. The RS-25 engines that are used on the SLS and the Space Shuttle run liquid oxygen through the engine bell in pipes before mixing with the liquid hydrogen for the launch. This is because liquid oxygen is really cold, so that it keeps the engine bell really cold as well. Now, the RS-68 use ablative cooling, where instead of trying to keep the engine bell cool, they use materials that dissipate the heat by melting away. The engines are literally melting away, which is just so cool. This also explains why Delta IV's plume is a bit red, unlike the RS-25 that burns nearly clear, even though both engines run liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen. Because of the material that is being used, the plume becomes red instead of clear. Kind of like fireworks, how you make them green and blue and red and green and all the different colors. I know I said green twice there, but you get it? They use different chemicals to do this. So why not use regenerative cooling? Well, it's because the RS-68 is designed to be simpler and cost less than the RS-25. So when the engineers were designing the RS-68, they looked and said it was cheaper and easier to design an ablative engine rather than a regenerative engine. And this is a common theme with the RS-68 and the Delta IV Heavy and Delta IV in general. Simplicity over the normal way things are done. For instance, the hydrogen explosion at liftoff. So prior to ignition, hydrogen and helium are run through the engines to get the vehicle ready for launch. Now, if you know anything about hydrogen and helium, you know that they are both really flammable. So when the engines ignite, the gases that have escaped and floated upwards also ignite, resulting in a huge fireball. Now, engineers could have made it so that none of the hydrogen escaped, but it required more parts on the engine and resulted in the engine costing more. So they decided to just make the common booster core capable of withstanding the heat and the flames. And that's just so cool because it's resulted in some really awesome liftoff where the entire Delta IV is literally on fire. But these simplifications also come back to hurt Delta IV a bit later on in its life with crew rating. But that's another story for another time and another topic. And that's enough of me geeking out over Delta IV. But let's talk about the third stage on this flight. So on this flight, and this flight only, Delta IV flew with a third stage. They used orbital ATK's Star 48, a solid vacuum-designed upper stage. The Star family of upper stages has been used basically since the beginning of the American space program. On the shuttle, they were called the Payload Assist Modules and would kick these satellites to GTO after being deployed from the shuttle's payload bay. But what I really want to talk about is what was written on the side of Delta IV. On Delta IV, they paint the names of contractors who provided major parts for the rocket. So usually it just says ULA, Boeing, and the Delta team. But on this flight, because the Star upper stage wasn't built by ULA, the name Orbital ATK was included. But for those of you who don't know, Orbital ATK was bought by Northrop Grumman in June, and the two became Northrop Grumman Innovation Systems. So this is likely the last time we'll ever see Orbital ATK flying to space on its own and not under Northrop Grumman. And there's something really somber about that. The Parker Solar Probe is the first mission to fly to the low corona of the Sun, and will be the fastest human-made object ever at 200 kilometers a second, which is 3 times faster than the current record holder, Helios. But the Parker Solar Probe is definitely not a new idea, even when it was being announced in 2009. You see, the idea for a probe like this was first envisioned in the early 90s under NASA's Outer Planets and Solar Probe program. That program included 3 spacecrafts: a mission to Pluto and the Kuiper Belt, a Europa orbiter, and a mission to the low solar orbit. Now, originally the solar probe was meant to conduct a flyby of Jupiter to place it into a low polar solar orbit. But in 2003, the program was canceled. This is because NASA Administrator Sean O'Keefe wanted to restructure NASA and her programs to be more aligned with the Bush administration's goal of having NASA refocus on research and development and addressing management shortcomings. But the Pluto and Kuiper Belt mission survived after a lengthy political battle. This probe became known as New Horizons, and in July of 2015, it flew by Pluto and will fly by a Kuiper Belt object on January 1st, 2019. But this left hope that someday the other 2 missions in the OPSP will be revived. And in 2009, that revival happened with the solar probe, but with some changes. First, we couldn't use Jupiter due to the time it takes to get there, and the fact that a radioisotope thermal generator, an RTG, would be needed to supply power. Had Jupiter been used, it would have taken 3.5 years to get to first perihelion, and then another 8 years to get to its second. But the upside was that we could study the poles of the Sun, and we'd get much closer, 3 radii compared to Parker's 9.5 radii. So how do we get this close now? By going to Venus. It turns out if you fly by Venus 7 times, you can get close enough to the corona to study it. But we aren't quite through the history yet. In May of 2017, NASA changed the name from the Solar Probe Plus to the Parker Solar Probe, in honor of Eugene Parker, the man who first proposed the idea of solar winds in the 1950s. This was also the first time NASA had named a probe after a living person. And it's really cool to see pictures of Professor Parker at the launch. And personally, I believe NASA should be doing this more often. So, now we're here at launch. The $1.5 billion probe built by Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab sitting on the pad, ready to begin its journey using the Delta IV Heavy.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6.
Parker Solar Probe is out there. Between now and November 2nd of 2024, the probe will conduct 7 flybys of Venus to reach an orbit where the perihelion is 0.040 astronomical units from the Sun. That's 4% of the distance between Earth and the Sun. And the first Venus flyby will occur on September 28th of 2018, with the first perihelion on November 1st of this year. 2 orbits later, on December 21st of 2019, Parker will fly by again. Then, another 2 orbits later, on July 6, 2020, it will encounter Venus for a 3rd time. After another 2 orbits, it will have its next encounter on February 16, 2021. Then, later that year, after another 2 orbits, we meet up with Venus again on October 11, 2021. Then we have some cruising time, and after 7 orbits, we encounter Venus on August 16, 2023. Finally, after 5 more orbits, we encounter Venus for our last time on November 2nd of 2024. After that, the planned mission has 5 more orbits. But what are we doing in the time between encounters? Well, the goals of the Parker Solar Probe are this. 1. To assess the structure and dynamics of the Sun's coronal plasma and the magnetic field. 2. Determine how energy flow heats solar corona and impels the solar wind. And 3. Determine the mechanism that accelerates and transports energetic particles. During its orbits, it will spend 11 days conducting scientific research when it's near the Sun. Following that, it will spend between 158 and 77 days cruising along and downlinking its data to Earth. But earlier we called Parker the most autonomous spacecraft ever. Why is that? Well, during the short periods when it's near the sun, Parker will experience extreme radiation that will cause communication interruptions, damage to materials and electronics, and much more. On top of that, any communications between the probe and the Earth will take 8 minutes to get there, meaning that it needs to be able to make decisions on its own in time-critical situations. So, what's next for the Parker probe? Well, in the last week, the probe has deployed high-gain antennas and electric field antennas, as well as the magnetometer boom. Instrument testing will occur in early September, and the first scientific observations will start in December. But what happens at the end of mission when Parker runs out of fuel? Well, it won't be able to stabilize itself and will begin to tumble, and as it approaches perihelion, the probe will break up and disintegrate, for all but the heat shield. That will remain orbiting the sun for millions and billions of years. And I don't know about you, but there's something beautiful about the image of that. God, this episode's getting really somber really quick. So, during the lead up to launch, there was a silent question going on all over social media. Did you hear it? Well, if you saw our last discussion video, you might have a good idea of what it was. Could Falcon Heavy do this mission? If you remember last time, we said that Falcon Heavy cost between $90 and $150 million. Delta IV Heavy costs $350 million. You could buy 2 or 3 Falcon Heavy launches at the cost of 1 Delta IV Heavy. And the answer to the question is maybe. There are some people on social media that have done the calculations and say that Falcon Heavy could do this mission with a 15% payload hit for reusability. But Troy Bruno has said that no, Delta IV is the only one that could do this, because of the ISP of the engine. Now, the ISP is what rocket engineers use to measure the efficiency of an engine. And Delta IV, using liquid hydrogen, has a really good efficiency compared to Falcon 9, which uses liquid kerosene and liquid oxygen. So Falcon Heavy probably could have done this mission, but it really doesn't matter, because when this mission's launch contract was given out, Falcon Heavy wasn't anywhere near being close to launch. And even today, Falcon Heavy does not have the certifications necessary to launch a mission like this. But this silent question is a symptom of a larger problem in the space community, and that's teams. It seems like more and more you have to be part of some team, be it Team SpaceX or Team ULA or Blue Origin or NASA or etc. And this mentality is not okay. Spaceflight is my passion, that's why I do these videos, to teach other people about spaceflight and encourage a discussion of spaceflight. But rockets shouldn't be like this competition. Spaceflight shouldn't be a competition. Noted that our greatest achievement in space was done through a competition between the two superpowers at the time. But even when we achieved this ultimate goal of landing on the moon, we didn't do it just as the US. When one rocket company succeeds, we all succeed. A moment when we should have been celebrating ULA's successful launch and all the knowledge we will gain from the Parker Solar Probe was drowned out by $200 million. And I don't know about you, but I don't like that. And this growing discourse caused by teams needs to stop. Because guess what? I'm not Team SpaceX or Team ULA or Team NASA. I'm Team Rocket. No, not you. And being Team Rocket, no, not you. And being Team Rocket is best shown by a tweet from Troy Bruno, the CEO of ULA. Delta IV Heavy's first launch was a test launch with a mass simulator exercising the rocket's capabilities. The test revealed a cavitation issue. The next flight had a real payload and was successful, as have all subsequent Falcon 9s, I'm going to assume he means Falcon Heavies here, has not yet flown to the Heavy performance, but is expected to soon. Tori isn't Team ULA. He's pro-ULA, sure, but he's Team Rocket as well. Personally, I interpret this tweet as Tori being excited for the future of Falcon launches through one line, but is expected to soon. Had this been some other CEO from some other undisclosed rocket company, that line would have been excluded, and the tweet would have read as a punch to Falcon 9 and Falcon Heavies. And do you want more proof that Tori is Team Rocket? In 2016, the VP of ULA, Brett Tobey, was bad-mouthing SpaceX to a group of engineering students. A day later, Tori put out a statement saying, "The views, positions, and inaccurate statements by Mr. Tobey presented at the recent speaking engagement were not aligned with the direction of the company, my views, nor the views I expect from ULA leaders." Mr. Tobey resigned his position at ULA effective immediately. You don't badmouth your friends, because when we're all one team, we're all in this together. When one of us fails, we all fail, and we help each other back up. and when one of us succeeds, we all succeed and celebrate the achievement together. That's what being part of Team Rocket is. And I'll leave you with this closing thought. The plaque that was left on the moon reads, "Here, men from the planet Earth first stepped foot upon the moon, July 1969 AD. We came in peace for all mankind." Though it was American astronauts who rode on an American rocket built by Americans in America, it wasn't just America who went to the moon. It isn't ever stated that these were Americans that stepped foot on the moon. It's stated that these were men from the planet Earth that stepped foot on the moon. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed, hit the like and subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We post space discussion videos every other Saturday and 2 new space newscasts a week on Tuesdays and Fridays. I'm Kyle Henry. Thank you so much for watching. My social medias are in the description below, as well as the sources that we used for this video.